Before we begin comparing the graphics and gameplay of Quest 2 and PCVR versions of Bonelab, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. There's so much more to Bonelab than graphics. Surely having a visually beautiful game is always important, but Boneworks didn't become a VR sensation that it is now because of visuals alone. Just like Boneworks, Bonelab is about experimental physical interactions that bring the VR experience to the next level, and that goes beyond just graphical aspects. But because Boneworks exists only as a PCVR title, the fact that Bonelab also arrived to a standalone Quest 2 is groundbreaking, and naturally we want to see how they made it happen and what needed to be compromised or sacrificed either in graphics or in the gameplay to make Bonelab on Quest 2 a reality. To discover that, let's take a deep dive, and if you're ready, let's go! The news that you see in the opening scene is probably the most disturbing thing that you will see in the entire game. But I tried to test how well you'll be able to interact with it, and it has this amazingly realistic feel to it. The way it hangs and folds, and how in both versions you could climb up to a certain point. Looking at it up close, you could see a tiny little fuzz on the rope in the PCVR version, and that of course was simplified on Quest, but overall the feeling was very realistic. There's not much difference in the execution scene either, except for maybe a slightly higher saturation on Quest 2. I've noticed it here and also in plenty of other scenes, which is pretty interesting because this is not the first time I've noticed a much higher saturation on Quest when compared to PCVR. The result was pretty similar with Zenith and with After the Fall. Lighting and little details like this lantern I would expect to see quite different on Quest, but they look pretty much identical on both versions of the game. This cave is the first place you start noticing the differences in the textures on the rocks. And of course on Quest you can see that the lantern doesn't actually provide this directional light. You can see that on PC the light actually generates this shadow, but it doesn't really do much on Quest. The difference in the light effect is especially noticeable when you come to this stone and you can see all the texture of it reflecting from your lantern, while it's a lot more faded out and flat on Quest. I would say so far the most noticeable differences are the textures of stones and these vines. While they looked fairly detailed and elaborate on PCVR, Quest 2 they looked as if they were made of paper. This is also the point where I noticed that the lighting in PCVR looks a lot more natural and kind of gloomy, and on Quest anytime there is a little bit more light, the room is filled with yellow glow. Still, the fact that they included the water droplets animation on Quest and it looks exactly the same way as on PCVR is shocking to me. Quest developers usually don't even bother with any water features in games, so this was a very pleasant surprise. But let's finally start breaking some stuff, and right here I tested breaking these barrels, and oh my goodness, the feel, the physics, and just the sensation of breaking it was the same on both versions of the game. Whether I was breaking these barrels or these wooden logs, it took about the same amount of effort, and I could see that the physics of breaking looked the same on both games. Frankly, the amount of saturation on Quest 2 was so far the most noticeable difference between the Quest and PCVR versions of the game. Because Boneworks is well known for giving you the ability to climb anywhere, of course I wanted to try the climbing mechanics, and especially this cage that was held by one chain. I wanted to see how it would look if I climbed on top of it, and here I could see that for some reason the Quest version would look kind of unstable. I see that I'm struggling to stand here and my legs are kind of being drawn to this chain, but in PCVR the physics seem to be a little bit more natural looking. Throughout the game I could see this soft glow around many of the objects on PCVR. That's something you often see in PCVR games, and it's also something easily sacrificed in Quest games, so that was expected. And here comes the first kill of the game. Let's look how I crushed the skull with my dagger in slow motion. You can see that the red bloody wound appears as soon as the dagger touches the skull in both versions. And then there goes this particle effect with dust flowing around, and honestly I was perfectly happy with the way they made it look on Quest. It's amazing. Throughout the gameplay I constantly kept being impressed by the similarity of the graphics on Quest and PCVR. I wouldn't say that oversaturation bothered me too much, but it is noticeable when you compare it side by side with the faded and more natural colors on PCVR. There were some parts where you could hardly notice any difference. Right here you can see some faint green fog, and on PCVR you can see that it extends on your weapon and on the skeleton, but on Quest those objects or subjects remain sort of the same color, unaffected by the fog. I've mentioned this before, but the rocks on Quest 2 is nothing impressive. The textures are very generic and don't stand out at all, especially compared to PCVR where you can see all the cracks and reflections. They look simply gorgeous, but here it doesn't really matter that much. Oh, and I forgot to kill this skeleton. It took me by surprise when he just jumped on me. But what matters here is not the texture of the stones, but their physics and their weight. In both versions, they are way too heavy to move with just one hand, and you need to use both of your hands to move them, and I have to say it were a little bit harder to move on the PCVR version than on Quest. Overall, accurate physical interactions were maintained in both versions, and as for Quest 2, this is some kind of witchcraft. I don't know how they managed to do it, but it's simply amazing how breaking anything here feels so natural and accurate and not at all different from PCVR. Whether I'm moving stones or breaking wood or cups or even computers, all the particles that I can see in this breakage look identical in both versions, and that's simply fascinating to me. Even though sometimes you still get occasional bugs like this weapon stuck in a barrel. And here's a small robotic creature that seems to be inspired by crabs from Half-Life Alyx that try to jump on your face and suck your brains out. Something incredible I've noticed here is the damage I do to it. I'm used to seeing detailed wounds and scars shown on PCVR and very simplistic ones on Quest, but here the dents and the holes I poked with my weapon looked extremely detailed and corresponded to the position of the landed hits. That's how you know the developers went all in and straight up refused to cut any corners with this game optimization. And also that's why Bonelab requires 7 gigs on your Quest. And finally, I know you've been waiting for me to shoot these strange, soulless creatures. They looked like ragged dolls that could barely stand on their 2 feet. I must say, those orange nets look pretty cool on Quest 2 with that oversaturation, creating those mysterious glowing effect. You could see the dark holes left by the bullets on both versions of the game. Messing with these bodies felt rather surreal because they behaved exactly as I would imagine a real body to behave. They were heavy and the physics behaved differently depending on whether I grabbed them by the torso or by their limbs. Such precision in calibration of in-game object manipulations is something I've never seen on standalone Quest 2. The final scene of the initial tutorial is the first massacre of the game. This is where we get to see the new type of enemies, little robots with holograms of humans. A wide variety of weapons is available to you in both versions of the game, including melee weapons and some guns. Again, the characters in PCVR, including the holograms, look a bit more glowy than on Quest 2. It's strange to see how they're just tripping and falling like the brainless entities they are. It's worth noting that when I entered the main lab for the first time, that the Quest 2 version for some reason has this ominous blue glow that does not exist in PCVR. It's a very strange difference, and it actually went away after I restarted my Quest. So I don't know if this is some kind of a glitch, but apparently this is not supposed to look like this. I added a few avatars to the game just to see how they will look in these two versions, and I honestly wouldn't be able to tell the difference between Quest and PCVR. I mean, even the fabric behavior is exactly the same. In fact, I can totally see some people preferring the Quest version more due to its saturation. And the sense of scale in this game is incredible. This avatar is 16 feet tall, and you totally feel like a giant, both in PCVR and on Quest. This part completely blew me away. While messing with avatars, the only part where I could notice a big difference is when I was looking at my hands on Quest and on PCVR while being this giant. On PCVR, you could see the tiny wrinkles and skin textures that really made it feel like they are your monster's hands, but on Quest they looked very low poly and lacked detail. Still, I must say that to date, this is the most incredible Quest 2 game optimizations that I have ever seen. And while playing on Quest, you can easily forget that you're not actually playing a PCVR title. This is completely groundbreaking. I would say that texture resolutions and detail is the only major thing that you would be sacrificing if you decide to play this game on Quest 2 instead of PCVR. Make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to DiscoVR for more. Thank you for watching, stay safe, and as always, happy gaming!